At the beginning of June 1987, the Sri Lankan Civil War was finally coming to a close. Operation Liberation had trapped the shattered remains of Tamil separatist forces in and around the city of Jaffna, and subsequently had placed the city under siege, with a continuous stream of attacks from the air and with artillery. Sri Lankan casualties stood at some 33 dead, 182 wounded. The Tamils, however, had lost hundreds. In response to what had become a massively uneven fight, the government of the Indian state of Tamil Nadu, urged on by growing unrest amongst the state's Tamil population, petitioned Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to intervene. Despite protests from the Sri Lankan government, the Indian Air Force launched Operation Poomalai on the 4th of June. Cargo aircraft escorted by fighter bombers violated Sri Lankan airspace and dropped tons of supplies into separatist-controlled Jaffna. Under threat of airstrike if they continued the siege, the Sri Lankans had no choice but to halt offensive operations the same day. Just under 2 months later, on the 27th of July, the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord was signed in Colombo. In order to establish a ceasefire and pave the way for reconciliation, the accord would force Sri Lankan forces to withdraw to their bases, ending all combat operations. In order to fill the gap left behind, the Indian Army would deploy 2 infantry divisions into the country to act as peacekeepers and to ensure the disarmament of Tamil militias. These militias, despite not being present at the negotiations, agreed to this as their only major concession. In return, the 2 major Tamil provinces would be merged into an autonomous state, the Tamil language would be made one of Sri Lanka's official languages, and most importantly for the militants, a general amnesty would be granted for all actions committed during the war. Without having to get his hands dirty, Rajiv Gandhi got to enjoy a moment in the sun, having been the man to end the 4-year Sri Lankan Civil War.
Before we go on, a word on ground news. Gandhi's goals in 1987 are much the same as Prime Minister Modi's today, to secure India's interests and establish itself as an international player. In fact, in recent weeks he's been on a trip to Europe, trying to satisfy both his traditional allies in Russia and his new partners in Europe. Here we can see a summary of the story based on the reporting of 45 separate sources that Ground News has gathered. That Modi and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk have discussed security issues, the war in Ukraine, and enhancing bilateral relations. We can see, using the bias tracker, that coverage among the left and centre is pretty equal, but there is a small dip in right-wing coverage, only 25%. And by using the interactive map, you can see that despite being a news story focused on India, the majority of reporting is coming out of the United States. We can see how different outlets have headlined the story. For example, Voice of America, a centrist outlet, focuses on the security and trade talks, while NDTV, a left-wing Indian outlet, focuses on India's potential role in ending the war. It's features and breakdowns like these that make Ground News a great asset to anyone who wants to keep up with the news, and find new stories or just new takes on stories. Many more than you could possibly fit in a single article. Personally, I like the ability to get a top-level view of what everyone's saying, and then easily go through the articles myself. It saves me a lot of time, and it's much easier than going through a dozen different websites every day. So, if you go to the link grand.news/MajorSamm, or use the link in the description and subscribe, not only will you be helping me to continue to make documentaries like this, you'll get 40% off the same unlimited access Vantage plan I'm using to stay up to date on Europe, the US, and India. And now, back to the video.
The Indo-Sri Lanka Accord began to collapse almost immediately. The Sri Lankans saw the Indians as an occupying force who had forced them to abandon total victory. The Tamils, especially the most radical separatists in the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, more commonly known as the Tamil Tigers, saw the Indians as having crushed their dreams of a truly independent Tamil state, and the Indian Army didn't really know what it was supposed to be doing there. The deployment was a mess, most units were somewhere between 1/3 to 2/3 strength, and the lack of facilities meant that men and equipment were scattered all over India and Sri Lanka. Even once they were finally on the ground and in place, they received little in the way of orders other than vague suggestions to keep the peace. The first major incident took place on the 15th of September, when Amir Phalangam Thilapan, a major player within the Tamil Tigers, being both its head of propaganda and the head of its Jaffna political wing, began a hunger strike in response to the Sri Lankans' refusal of the Tamil Tigers' nominee for the chief minister of the new Tamil province, and in return the refusal by the Indians to force the issue. He would die 11 days later, and his funeral would be attended by thousands. Tamils, both civilian and militant, began to turn on the Indians, with scattered reports of arson and violence breaking out in the east. Then, on the 2nd October, an Indian post in Trincomalee on the Sri Lankan east coast was attacked in a drive-by shooting, in which a sepoy from the 26th Punjab, Gorak Ram, was killed instantly. That evening, a Sri Lankan Navy patrol intercepted a boat carrying 17 Tamil Tigers, including 2 high-ranking commanders, Poolandran and Kumaran. Poolandran had previously been wanted for at least 34 murders and involvement in the 17th of April Alufoya massacre that had resulted in the deaths of at least 127. These charges, however, had been dropped as part of the amnesty. What the amnesty didn't protect them from, however, was the discovery of 2 automatic rifles aboard the boat. The Tamils claimed that they needed them for self-defense, but regardless, they were in violation of the accord, and they were all quickly arrested and taken to the Sri Lankan base at the Pillarisetti airfield which they shared with the Indian army. The Tamils protested immediately, stating that the Sri Lankan army holding the men prisoner violated the accord, and threatened that if the prisoners were killed, whether by the army or by execution once tried, then the accord was null and void. The Indians, seeing how quickly the situation was deteriorating, agreed to intervene, and took the prisoners from Sri Lankan custody and into their own, transferring them to their base on the same airfield. To say the Sri Lankans weren't best pleased would be an understatement, and our men pursued the Indian troops back to their base. Over the following hours, a standoff began. By the time the standoff ended, after days of negotiations, the Indians had finally agreed to hand the prisoners back over to the Sri Lankans for transfer to Colombo for trial. At 5 p.m. on the 5th of October, they were handed back to the Sri Lankan army, and within minutes, the 17 men had taken cyanide pills smuggled in with their meals by sympathizers. Despite a frantic effort by Sri Lankan and Indian medics, 12 of the 17 were dead. In the immediate hours following the suicides, the Tamil Tigers began a campaign of what can only be best described as random manic violence. In Jaffna, 6 Indian troops were forced from their vehicle and murdered. 8 kidnapped Sri Lankan soldiers were executed. 4 employees of a Sri Lankan television company were abducted and murdered on their way back from work in Pillali. Just north of Pillali, 2 managers of a cement factory were murdered. Sri Lankan bases were attacked at Point Pedro, Ponsamanar, and Fort Jaffna. Over the next 24 hours, at least some 150 civilians were murdered across northern Sri Lanka, including women, children, and even Tamil moderates. This in addition to the hundreds killed in random acts of violence, primarily targeting Sri Lankan civilians, since the death of Philapan the previous month. From the eastern Tamil province alone, 20,000 Sri Lankan civilians had fled, sparking a refugee crisis that was quickly getting out of hand. The Sri Lankan government immediately informed the Indians that, unless they retaliated, they would be forced to do so themselves. Little did they know, the Indians were already drawing up their own plans against the Tamil Tigers. Rajiv Gandhi himself had been deeply affected by the killing of the 6 Indian soldiers, and the Indian government was coming to the conclusion that the LTTE had no intention of ending armed resistance, instead wanting either the Sri Lankans or the Indians to make the first move, and save the Tamils the bad press. The LTTE's strategy could best be described by the Tamil writer Sachi Kantha, who had 2 peculiar observations about the head of the Tamil Tigers, a particularly non-threatening looking man by the name of Pirabhakaran. The first being that he seemed to base his personality on that of his favourite actor, Clint Eastwood. Kantha said that this was personified by his prudence, his intelligence, his suspicion of strangers, and his dogged determination. An American journalist retorted, "As far as I can tell, Eastwood's loftiest strategy in these movies is to shoot the shit out of anything that moves. That doesn't bode well for the future of Sri Lanka." Kantha also described Prabhakaran's strategy against the Indians as the Jimmy Malone offense. Quoting Sean Connery as veteran Chicago police officer Jimmy Malone in The Untouchables, which had only recently been released that June, "If you want to get Capone, here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way." If that truly was the way the game was being played, then the Tamil Tigers got exactly what they wanted a few days later. On the 9th and 9th October, into the early hours of the 10th, the Indian Army raided 4 businesses linked to the LTTE, a radio station at Tavadi, a TV station at Cockerville, and 2 newspaper offices. The following morning, they retaliated accordingly, rousing up demonstrations against the Indians, while small groups carried out attacks just about anywhere an Indian soldier could be found. The 5th Madras were machine gun and mortared in Talapalai, and the patrol of the 1st Maratha Light Infantry was ambushed in Jaffna. Both of these attacks, however, resulted in no casualties. In another attack, however, in Talapalai, a convoy of the Indian Central Reserve Police was attacked and resulted in 4 dead and 7 injured. And in Jaffna, as 5 men of the 10th Paracommando returned from the city, having gone out to buy sports equipment, the jeep was stopped, the men were dragged from the vehicle, and all were killed. Now the Indians had no choice but to retaliate. The head of the 54th Infantry Division, Major General Harkirat Singh, had decided that the raids were just the opening show of force, and that 10th October would mark the beginning of Operation Pawan. The Indian Army was going to cut off the Jaffna Peninsula from the rest of the island, and they were going to take control of Jaffna City to forcibly disarm and detain the LTTE. Singh estimated that the Tamil Tigers only had some 1,500 fighters in the area, armed mostly with small arms, and while they'd be dug in along what was believed to be 3 tiers of positions on the approaches to inner city Jaffna, the Indians believed that they simply had the manpower to wash over and overwhelm them. The IPKF, the Indian peacekeeping force on Sri Lanka, consisted of 2 infantry divisions, the 54th and the 36th. Between them, they had 6 infantry brigades, of 3 infantry battalions each. The problem, however, was that these units were still under strength. The component battalions were still only just trickling into the area from elsewhere, and they were still without the supporting elements. 2 of the 54th brigades were still in the area of operations of the 36th, where they'd been brought in by ship to Trincomalee Harbour, leaving the 54th with 1 of their own brigades, the 91st, and 1 brigade of the 36th, the 18th. And of these 2 brigades, they each only had 1 battalion available and ready to commence the operation. There was a 3rd battalion in Jaffna, but they were essentially under siege in Jaffna Fort alongside the Sri Lankan army. To compensate, Singh had a few loose units, a battalion from the 25th Mechanised Infantry Regiment, the 831st Light Artillery Regiment, and the 10th Paracommando Battalion. The advance on Jaffna was, to put it simply, a mess. Beginning half-heartedly throughout the morning of the 11th, the rules of engagement hadn't been updated to reflect the reality that a shooting war were now underway, and so the Indian forces had to fight, as they put it, with one hand tied behind its back. There hadn't even been much in the way of a briefing for the men. 2 battalions of the Indian Army simply got aboard their vehicles and drove, or marched, directly down their assigned roads into Jaffna. There, they were harassed by snipers, small teams of militants, or met by mobs of outraged Tamil civilians. The LTTE, having learned a few lessons from the conflict in Northern Ireland, hid gunmen inside the crowds or in buildings watching over the crowds. Their effect was devastating. The Indian troops, unsure of what to do, were caught completely off guard by both the crowds confronting them and then by the ensuing ambushes. Inevitably, there were civilian casualties. The Tamil Tigers then used those casualties to initiate a massive propaganda campaign and rile up more crowds. The masterstroke of the Indian plan, however, to pacify Jaffna and end the LTTE, was a quick, decisive commando raid that was planned to be over in a matter of hours. The thinking at division headquarters being that, since the small number of Tamil militants in Jaffna were now occupied in defensive actions all over the edge of the city, the LTTE political headquarters in Cockerville, near the University of Jaffna, should be both lightly protected and packed with the entire organisation's leadership. Ironically, the idea of simply walking into Pirabhakaran's headquarters and gunning down anyone that moved had previously been raised in meetings, only to have been dismissed by Major General Singh since, in his words, as an organised and honourable army, the Indian Army didn't function that way. The plan was brutally simple. A force roughly 120 strong from B Company, 10th Paracommando, was to land on the playing field of the University of Jaffna, the only site suitable for landing helicopters. Then they would secure the field and mark it with flares for D Company of the 13th Sikh Light Infantry, who would be flown in to take over security, while the paracommandos would move out to raid the headquarters in Cockaville. While the Sikhs occupied the playing field, the fellow C Company and Headquarters Company would be flown in alongside supporting elements, and the whole battalion would clear the university complex and clear out the LTT military headquarters that was believed to be located somewhere within. Once they were done, they'd dig in and await a relief column from the 72nd and 91st Brigades. The paracommandos would do the same, linking up with either the 18th Brigade at the Jaffna bus stand or waiting in place for the 72nd. The first wave was expected to set off from Pillari at around midnight, and the Sikhs would follow up and be reinforced over the following hours. The relief column was expected by 6 am. It was believed that this was more than enough time to get the job done. To move the better part of 500 men, Major General Singh had requested 9 Mi-8 Prataps from the Indian Air Force for transport, and a Chetak piloted by a Major Chaudhry had been assigned to make reconnaissance flights over the area on the morning of the operation. Because of weight considerations, the Mi-8s had to lose all their weapons and their extra fuel tanks in order to carry full loads and extra equipment, meaning there would be zero fire support for men on the ground. Luckily for the Indians, however, the Sri Lankans were ecstatic that the Indians and the Tamils were fighting each other, and they were more than happy to offer Sri Lankan Air Force gunship to provide air support. The crew, who had been trained by British mercenaries, would be flying a Bell 212 and would be responsible for pinning down any possible reinforcements that showed up west of the railway line that ran just outside of the university grounds and marked the boundary of the operational area. 10 Paracommando, technically under Colonel Dalbir Singh, who was currently stuck in Colombo, was for the raid under the Commander Major Shionan Singh, the unit's second in command, and team leader, what they called Company Commander, Major Rajiv Nair, as well as Captain Ranbir Bhadauria. Under them there were 116 men and the unit medical officer, Captain Ajit Venayor. There were a degree of nerves among the paracommandos. They'd only been made aware of the plan the previous day, and little was known about how the Tamil Tigers were organised, or where they even actually were. A fact made worse by the fact the Indian Army had no maps to give them, and so the paracommandos had had to ask to photocopy the Sri Lankan Army's maps. Also cause for concern was that they were going up against an enemy armed with modern M16 and G3 rifles, armed themselves with an arsenal from the 1940s and 50s, SLRs, Sterling SMGs and Bren light machine guns. Their only advantage over the LTTE were their heavier weapons, their medium machine guns and Carl Gustav recoilless rifles, as well as a handful of night vision sights. While the paracommandos were nervous, they were nowhere near the state the Sikhs were in. They had been earmarked for the raid despite never having taken part in or even trained for combat drops in helicopters before. And they weren't even in the country yet. They began arriving in drips from North India that morning, having been diverted from their original deployment in central Sri Lanka. Once on the ground at Pillari, they were only alerted to their role in the operation when the relief force from 72nd Brigade, which was really just an understrength battalion from the 5th Gurkha Rifles, who had only just landed themselves that morning, set off at 6 p.m. only an hour after the last of the Sikhs had arrived. Like most units in the peacekeeping force, they were missing anywhere from 30 to 50% of their manpower. And except in the Sikhs' case, it was even worse, because 2 plane loads of the unit hadn't even made it to Pillari after having been forced to turn back around in India due to engine trouble in transit. Even the Air Force was struggling. Of the 9 Mi-8s requested, only 4 were available on the day, and these had to be sourced from 3 separate units. The 107th, the 109th, and the 112th. And of these 4 helicopters, only 2 of the 4 pilots had been able to accompany the reconnaissance flight as planned to scout out the landing sites. The other 2 had been called away on urgent resupply missions elsewhere. And what the 2 pilots who had been aboard the Chetak had found out wasn't good. The plan had been to go in flights of 4, dropping off some 80 men at a time. Instead, they found that the playing field could at best accommodate 2 helicopters in the dark, meaning that, at the last minute, the plan had to be altered. Now, the plan was to have 2 helicopters in the air and 2 on the ground picking up or dropping off troops at any one time, trying to make the most of lost time. Despite the risk and the slapdash nature of the plan, at midnight on the 12th of October, the first wave of paracommandos boarded the first 2 helicopters. These were piloted by Wing Commander Sepra and Squadron Commander Viniraj. The paracommandos shouted the battle cry and began the 2.5-minute journey to Jaffna University. Behind them, the second pair of helicopters prepared to set off, flown by Flight Lieutenant Prakash and squadron leader Duraswamy. Immediately upon getting into the air, Sapra and Vinayaraj encountered issues. The weather forecast turned out to be incorrect, and the pilots were forced to keep to about 200 meters altitude in order to be able to see anything. In the dark, the two helicopters struggled to stay in formation, having been forced to turn off all lights except a single light above the tail rotor, which too had to be turned off as they approached the university. Despite these issues and some minor drift, the first pair of helicopters arrived over the playing field, all of 3 minutes after takeoff. Captain Bhadauria was the first out. He threw the rope out the door of the helicopter and followed it down as shooting began around him. He almost became the first casualty, not because of the incoming fire, however, but because the pilots decided to land the helicopters instead of waiting for the paracommandos to take the ropes down. Bhadauria became entangled in the rope and almost dragged away as the helicopter began to take off again, only to free himself at the last second. Around him, the rest of the paracommandos had followed Major Shionan out of the Mi-8 and scattered around the landing zone, linking up with men from the other helicopter. Together, they established a perimeter as a force of Tamil militants fired down upon them from the university buildings. They were immediately aware of the fact that many more men were there than should have been present. Sapra alerted Pillari that he deployed his troops and told them to send in the second pair of helicopters. As the second pair of Mi-8s flew over Jaffna, Prakash and Duraswamy realized that they were lost. They could see tracer fire and explosions all over the area where the university was, as well as tracer fire from the Sri Lankan gunship, and they became disoriented. They tried to pick out the flares that the paracommandos had been supposed to mark the landing ground with, but under the heavy fire they'd been unable to put them down in time. The pair turned back to Pillari, their 40 men still aboard. Unawares, Sapra and Vinayaraj had picked up the next load of paracommandos, and it wasn't long before they were closing in on the playing field once again. This time, though, the Tamils were ready. They'd repositioned teams of men to the roof on the buildings on the north end of the playing field, and now they were firing on the helicopters as they approached, with assault rifles and machine guns, including at least one M2 Browning. The two helicopters began taking hits. One round went straight through the hull of one of the helicopters and hit a paracommando. Despite the heavy fire, though, the two managed to land, and the wounded man refused to return to Pillari, following the rest of the men out onto the field. Even as they took off again, the fire only continued to get heavier, as the Tamils brought in more men and moved to surround the playing field. As they approached Pillari, the second pair of Mi-8 should have been landing the first load of Sikhs, as outlined in the plan. However, Sapra and Vinayaraj found that the two other Mi-8s were still sitting on the tarmac, and still carrying the first load of 40 paracommandos. After what was probably a heated discussion, a new plan was drawn up. Duraswamy became Sapra's number 2, and Prakash became Vinayaraj's. So, at least they could find their way to the landing site, and Sapra and Vinayaraj would begin ferrying the Sikhs. But then, there was a second issue. The Sikhs, completely untrained in helicopter operations, had not been ready on the tarmac to board, and instead they had to be hunted down elsewhere on the airbase by the base's air traffic control team and the base commander, and then led to the waiting helicopters. And then they realised that the plan had not factored in that the Sikhs, both because it was a leg infantry unit, and they'd only just arrived in the 12 hours before, had to ferry in all its ammunition to the landing site in transport boxes aboard the helicopters, the weight of them reducing capacity from 20 to 15 men. It had taken 20 minutes to rouse the Sikhs, and now they were carrying less men than planned. The whole thing was now running dangerously behind schedule. Sapra and Duraswamy reached the university to find the scene lit by fire from all sides. Both helicopters took rounds, but they managed to land regardless, and their passengers, 20 paras and 15 Sikhs, managed to get out unscathed, along with the ammunition boxes. As the pair took off once again and alerted the second pair, Sapra's Mi-8 took a hit which severed its hydraulics. Now that the helicopters had shown up once again after their absence, when the second pair approached the university, all attention was directed on them. Now, multiple heavy machine guns and countless small arms were being fired from all over the campus towards the approaching helicopters. In Vinayaraj's helicopter, one burst shredded the battery compartment, another round shattered the windshield, and yet another went almost vertically up through the seat that would have been occupied by the flight engineer. The final major hit they took entered through the left side of the cockpit and severed the fuel shut-off valve. And then there seemed to be a brief pause in the firing, just before two streaks of light passed just ahead of the helicopters as RPG teams arrived to reinforce the Tamil Tigers. Still, the pair touched down, and the paracommandos jumped out and joined up with the men, now holding positions in cover around the field. The Sikhs, however, initially panicked, throwing themselves down in the middle of the field, only making it a few meters from the helicopter, and in the scramble, they'd forgotten their ammunition. Vinay had to go back into the cargo compartment, and with the rear flight crew, dump the 500 kilos of boxes, and then call back some of the Sikhs to handle the ammunition. Unfortunately, it was only discovered later that the boxes had contained mortar ammunition, but no mortars, and they had been loaded for no good reason whatsoever against orders. The delay on the ground set them back minutes, but eventually, riddled with bullets, the two got off the ground, and pursued by yet even more fire, returned to Pillari. When Vinay touched down, the damage sustained quickly became obvious, as the Mi-8 touched down, lurched, and then settled at an angle forward and to the right. Flight engineer jumped out and inspected the helicopter, finding that they were missing the left wheel and the tyre on the nose wheel, and the battery compartment had lost its cover, and there were at least 17 major bullet holes. Sapra's Mi-8, which had arrived earlier, had also been on a one-way trip. The hydraulic system was wrecked, and it had seemed a miracle that it had managed to nurse the helicopter all the way back to Pillari. With the two helicopters out of action, the remaining two helicopters were the only ones still capable of transporting Indian troops in all of northern Sri Lanka. And so, taking into account that it seemed Tamil reinforcements were still arriving at the university, and landing more troops was only going to result in the destruction of the other two helicopters, the decision was made to call off the rest of the drops. Less than half of the forces were on the ground, and while the paracommandos were at full strength, there were all 30 Sikhs on the playing field, a mix of an infantry platoon and a machine gun platoon, under the command of Company Major Birendra Singh and a junior NCO. The remaining Sikhs, under Lieutenant Colonel Sathi, loaded themselves onto 6 3-ton trucks, and at 1:30 a.m, and armed with only a single 1930s-era map to guide them, they set off to catch up with the relief force. The paracommandos and the Sikhs held their position under fire from all sides for another hour and a half. The message finally came at 3 a.m. that there'd be no more reinforcements, and for all units to continue the plan as written. At Pillari, HQ had realised that there were no contingency plans, and so had spent an hour and a half trying to raise Lieutenant Colonel Sathi to ask him what he wanted the platoon to do now that it was left alone. Sathi's orders were simply for the 30 men to hold on until the relief column arrived. Little did he know, one of the first casualties the Sikhs had on the playing field was the radio man. And so his order was heard instead by the paracommandos, whose CEO challenged Sathi. Major Sushant Singh made it very clear that the Sikhs would be dead once daylight came, and recommended the paracommandos take the Sikhs with them. But Sathi told him that his order was final. Paracommandos decided to stick around and try to support the Sikhs while they improved their position, telling them to move off the field and establish a defence in a nearby building. The Sikhs refused to move, with Major Birendra Singh saying, "No, my commanding officer is going to come, so I must meet him here." Unable to help, the paracommandos moved out sometime around 3:30 a.m. That was the last time any Indians saw the Sikhs alive. The paracommandos headed west, crossing over the railway into the suburb of Cockaville. Now that the Sri Lankan gunship had returned to base, the streets were empty, and nothing could be heard except the battle at the university playing field. While they were stopped to get the bearings and plan a route to the Tamil headquarters, Captain Bhadauria and Havildar Shayar Singh were sent to a nearby radio tower to try and bring it down. After a failed initial attempt, they managed to get a fuse lit, and seeing Tamil reinforcements passing nearby, the pair made a quick exit back to the rest of the unit. About a minute later, the tower came down in a pair of explosions, and the whole unit moved on. Around daybreak, and not entirely sure where they were in the maze of streets, the group encountered a man who said he could lead them to the Tamil Tigers HQ, which was only about 300 meters away, but he warned them that there were at least 200 militants there. They agreed to follow the man on the condition that his son came too, as insurance. As they got further from the university, they finally lost contact with the Sikhs, having moved outside range of the handheld radios, though for now they could still hear the fighting. At 7 a.m, still following the man, the paracommandos were deep into Cockaville. In what was by Jaffna standards an upper-class suburb, the tree-lined roads here were hemmed in by walled compounds that contained upper-class villas. It was still quiet, and since the radio tower there'd been no sign of Tamil Tigers. until they turned onto a wide avenue, and almost immediately they were under fire from all sides, including from above in the coconut trees. Return fire quickly silenced the ambush, and the Tamils melted away into the surrounding. The guide's son had been shot through the head by a paracommando in the heat of the moment, and one paracommando had been hit in the leg, but had managed to catch sight of the man who had shot him. The Carl Gustav launcher was brought up and fired into the house only 70 meters away. The sound of the explosion gave way to the sounds of women and children crying out. The paracommandos decided to pick up the pace and began moving quickly down the road, but soon, once again, a building to their front opened up. This time, though, it was only a couple dozen meters away, but in the confusion, the Indians ended up scattered up and down the road. In the lead, however, Bhadauria and his second led a charge against the building, where they could see the fire coming from. They barreled in through the front door, and a Tamil attempted to charge the pair back, but at close range, the man was riddled with submachine gun fire, and chaos erupted within the house. In the following minutes, the house was cleared of militants, both men and women, as more paracommandos caught up with Bhadauria and his second. With the house cleared, Bhadauria turned back to assess the situation. It was about 7:45 a.m. The paracommandos behind him were now also in fights against ambushes that had opened up from all sides up and down the road. They'd begun taking casualties. Despite the risk, Bhadauria led the men forward and moved on, clearing the way. When he looked back again, things had deteriorated. The rest of the unit was still some 50 meters away and still under fire, and more men were laid in the road. Some wounded, some possibly dead. The order came to halt. Captain Venior began setting up an aid station in an abandoned house, and the decision was made to call off the raid, fortify, and hold until relieved. Once B Company had fought off the initial ambushes and reorganized, it was holding 6 villas along both sides of Pirampadi Lane. The families living in the villas had been moved into whichever rooms either didn't have windows or were furthest from harm. At the frontmost villa, Bhadauria had 8 men with him holding down 2 possible angles the Tigers may attack from. A side street to his left he covered with his Bren, and on a stretch to his right through scrubland he had covered with a medium machine gun. All the points in between were covered with riflemen with SLRs. Around them they could see groups of men and women moving around, but with no weapons visible they simply watched them pass out of view. By 8:30 the fighting had died down enough that Major Nair somewhere down the road sent up men with tea. It was the first time any of the men had had anything to drink since some time before they boarded the helicopters. While the men sat and drank their tea, a bizarre series of events took place. Bhadauria spotted a Tamil leaving one of the ambush sites on a push bike, stood up from his chair and shouted for him to stop, but the Tamil kept on riding. Bhadauria fired a burst from his Sterling, hitting the man square in the back, but without even flinching, or really reacting at all, his shirt tattered and bloodied, the Tamil just kept on riding. Bhadauria sat back down, baffled, stood back up again, and then a sniper's bullet passed where he'd just been sitting and through the chair. The men threw themselves down, Bhadauria took up the Bren gun and opened fire on where he believed the round had come from, and the whole battle recommenced. Over the following hours, the intensity of the fighting only increased, escalating to the point where on 2 occasions, the Tigers sent men charging through open ground in an attempt to storm Bhadauria's villa. During one of the 2 assaults, a Tamil managed to get a grenade through one of the windows before being cut down, and the 2 men manning the medium machine gun were wounded, and the gun rendered inoperable. At another of the windows, a rifleman was hit by rifle fire. Bhadauria stayed on the Bren gun with a second man, Arvind Kumar, passing magazines. He was putting down so much fire that by the time he got down to the last magazine, the barrel was glowing red. The situation in the other villas was much the same. Major Shionan estimated that they were under attack from a force around 400 to 500 strong. 3 of the men in his makeshift headquarters had been shot in the chest, killing one outright, and leaving the other 2 to die over the following hours. In the aid station in the back of the headquarters, Captain Venior narrowly avoided death when shrapnel from a hand grenade was stopped by the camera hanging round his neck. In an attempt to give him some breathing room, Major Shionan requested artillery support against the rules of engagement. But instead of being told it was against the rules of engagement, he was simply informed that there was no ammunition available for the guns in the entire country. The Sri Lankans, though, overhearing the exchange, offered the use of one of the heavy mortar detachments, but to coordinate, they needed a common reference point. Chaudhry's Chetak was sent out from Pilali, and soon was trying to spot the paracommandos through the foliage. Shonan had 2 men climb the roof of his makeshift headquarters to act as spotters. one with a sari soaked in kerosene to be used as a beacon. Once the location were fixed, the Sri Lankans opened up with the 120mm mortars. The first round went way off, but now the paracommandos on the roof could shout down corrections to Shonan, who could pass them on to the radio man, who could relay them via Chowdhury to the Sri Lankans. The effect of this drawn-out chain was that the next round landed just outside the headquarters, taking off the leg of Lance Nayak Gangaram, who had already been wounded storming one of the villas earlier, and having personally taken out 3 Tamils. In the other spotter, Umesh was gouged in the hip. Ganga, seeing the state he was in, took up his rifle and shot himself. Umesh was carried to Veniyor, who told Shonan that saving his life would use up most of the unit's medical supplies. Shonan told the doctor, "Don't ask me, take a practical decision. Take a medical call. If the choice is between saving 1 life or saving 10 lives, we must save 10 lives." Veniyor made do with clothes taken from the house cut up into bandages, but Umesh would die of blood loss 2 hours later. At 11 AM, after having been corrected, the shelling had dissuaded the Tamils from launching any more attacks, and they'd called Pillari to ask for a ceasefire along Pirampati in order to collect all their wounded. This, though, the paracommandos refused. In fact, Shonan requested the Sri Lankans put down more rounds on the casualty collection parties, but the Sri Lankans told him to save the rounds, as they only had 9 left. The Tamils, unaffected, resumed their attacks. By the early afternoon, the fighting had once again peaked. At the front, in Captain Bhadauria's position, things were beginning to get tense. Ammunition was running dangerously low for everyone, and while he was trying to raise Major Nair at the other end of the street to have ammunition sent up, Kumar began breaking down the inoperable machine gun belts into rounds for the riflemen's SLRs, buying them another 600 rounds or so of time. During one of the lulls, Bhadauria began having his wounded sent back to the aid station, and Major Nair finally got back to Bhadauria to tell him that it was simply too dangerous to send men with ammunition to his position. But he would try to go as far as possible up the road and leave some for his men. So Bhadauria made the decision that it was finally time to fall back. Bhadauria's group began leapfrogging back down the road 2 houses via the gardens to the villa where Nair had left the supply cache for the team. Bhadauria and Kumar were the last to leave, and Bhadauria was almost killed once again when he became tangled in barbed wire at the boundary of the villa, in full view of the Tamils. But Kumar stood over him and put down suppressing fire in order to keep them away while he freed himself. It took a while for the Tamils to occupy the house that had been evacuated. Obviously, they were nervous about a trap, and they put a significant amount of rounds and grenades into it, before risking another assault. Then, once they'd occupied that villa, it took them a while longer to risk moving on to the next one, the one Bhadauria's team had bypassed. Inside the new position, Bhadauria could see the Tamils preparing the next advance, his remaining men waiting until the Tamils were at the boundary of the 2 properties, far away from any cover. Then they opened up, and in a few seconds the fight was over. By 4 PM, the fighting was dying down. The Tamils gave up on assaulting the paracommandos, and they seemed to have called off a lot of the men who were firing from concealment. Now only occasional shots rang out. The last major action of the paracommandos sadly ended in tragedy. Having spotted one of the remaining militants, one of the teams had the Carl Gustav brought up. The round hit its target, but the backblast brought down one of the villa's interior walls, and with it the roof caved in, killing the 7 civilians who were sheltering in the back of the house. As the fighting ended and dusk rolled in, casualties sat at 6 dead and 14 wounded, including Major Shonan, who had taken shrapnel dangerously close to his spine. The LTT had lost at least 40, but possibly up to 100 killed and wounded, and there were at least a dozen civilian casualties, including women and children. Going back to midnight on the 11th October, about 360 kilometers away in Madras, India, Squadron leader Anil Kaul was given the order to get his 6 T-72s into Jaffna immediately. The international airport at Misadventure had been closed to civilian traffic, and the T-72s came in under their own power, straight off the highway and onto the tarmac. They found that the Air Force had provided them with a single IL-76, and the promise of 2 more the next day. By early morning, stripped of just about every single kilo of excess weight, a single T-72 was sent ahead of the rest. Kaul's armoured squadron, part of the 65th Armoured Regiment, was supposed to land throughout the afternoon of the 11th, in conjunction with 4-5 Gurkha rifles, who had begun arriving at 10:30 am to form Brigadier B.D. Mishra's 72nd Infantry Brigade. The Gurkhas under Lieutenant Colonel I.B.S. Bauer were in much the same situation as the Sikhs would be later that afternoon. They had been told that they were going to take part in garrison duties, but upon arrival of the last man in Pillari around 4 p.m, they were given short notice that they were going into combat that night in order to relieve a raid force, and their only support would be, with the exception of the lone T-72 that had arrived, the yet-to-arrive armoured squadron. Despite the non-arrival of the armour, the Gurkhas were given their 4 allotted radios, 1 for each company, and set off into Jaffna at 6 p.m. The expected time of arrival, 2 a.m. on the 12th. First contact with the enemy was made only 4 kilometres from Pillari and Punalai Caravan, where C Company began taking fire from militants concealed within houses. The ambush was quickly overwhelmed, however, as the Gurkhas managed to pin the shooters down and outflank them, capturing them alongside a cache of landmines and explosives. A Company, who were running parallel, came under fire around the same time from the school building, though they were unable to replicate C Company's success, and had to bring up the tank to silence the fire. Realizing that resistance was much heavier than expected, the Gurkhas changed tactics. Rather than forcing their way down the main road and subjecting themselves to ambushes, they began clearing the entire village house by house before moving on. It was during the clearing that the Gurkhas took the first casualties, when a mine detonated, killing Rifleman Ganesh Bahadur Thapa and wounding A Company commander Major Gardner, as well as 3 others. Gardner's wounds were severe enough that he had to be evacuated back to Pillari. The advance continued onto the edge of the next village, Urallu. There, Major Varghese, a Tamil speaker and commander of C Company, approached a group of civilian women watching the Indian advance. After a brief conversation, he turned back, and as he walked away to rejoin his men, a girl emerged from the group holding a rifle and shot the major through the shoulder. He too had to be evacuated, and C Company was taken over by a junior NCO. By the time the Gurkhas were within a kilometre of the centre of Urallu, it was 4 a.m. They were a third of the way to the university. After linking up with the Gurkhas still in Urallu at 6:45 a.m, the rest of the 13th Sikh Light Infantry and their 6 trucks had advanced alongside them for only about an hour and a half, before Safi had received orders at 8:15 to take his men off the main road and to use side roads to make it to their surrounded platoon, and the 2 units split up. The side roads, however, cut through terrain that was much more built up than the main road, and the small number of Sikhs were quickly overwhelmed by ambushes and hit-and-run teams trying to slow them down. The Sikh advance was quickly ground to a halt and cost them 1 man killed, 1 man wounded. The difficulty was made exponentially more difficult by the fact that a large proportion of the men attacking them were dressed as civilians, and were hiding weapons in their lungis, a type of calf-length men's skirt. By 1:30 p.m, they were crawling their way forward once again down a road parallel to the main road, and by 2:15 p.m, they'd made it as far as Condaville, only a kilometre away from where they believed the trapped platoon to be. The problem, however, was that for whatever reason, the wrong location had been given to Sathi as to where his men had been dropped. Soon after, they were once again halted by what the after-action report called a wall of fire, as mortars, rocket teams, and hidden machine gun emplacements all opened up around them. Attempts to break through all met with failure, and the Sikhs were forced to dig in a position along the KKS Jaffna railway. There, they put out a distress call to the rest of the brigade before they lost contact. They would suffer another 5 men killed and 27 wounded by the time communications were restored. In Madras, the 2 IL-76s that would carry Kaul and 2 more of his T-72s to Pillari had arrived in the very early hours of the 12th. But the process of getting the tanks loaded turned into a small nightmare. Word had got out of the presence of tanks at the airport, and now a crowd had gathered at the perimeter fence, waving banners decrying the Indian Tamil killing force and throwing stones. On the airport side of the fence, both the tankers and the airport staff believed the others should have the equipment necessary to load and secure the tanks, but neither did, meaning the whole operation ended up being rather slapdash. Then, right before they were about to leave, the most senior junior NCO began complaining of sudden illness, despite being in fine health up until that moment. Kaul was suspicious, as the JNCO was in charge of the stash of imported goods belonging to the squadron commander who Cole had replaced at short notice in order to oversee the transport of the tanks. Cole took the man aside, told him to make himself scarce, and threatened to shoot him if he ever saw him again. At 8:30 a.m., the IL-76s took off towards Jaffna. On arrival, Cole was snatched away to report to Division HQ, in order to report to Major General Harkarat, who, coincidentally, had been Cole's instructor at the Indian Defence Services Staff College. Cole later wrote that what Harkarat told him had stuck with him ever since. As the general fidgeted in his chair, he lamented, "I was sent to keep the peace, and suddenly they expect me to fight a war." After the meeting, Cole was quickly moved on to 2 more meetings. First, with the colonel of the general's staff, who, in Cole's words and without a hint of sarcasm, he told me that the road to Jaffna had been cleared of all opposition. However, I was to be careful of improvised explosive devices, snipers sitting on trees or in high buildings along the road, and medium machine guns operating from heights. Otherwise, the road was clear. An understatement par excellence. The final meeting was had over the last meal he'd eat for 5 days. He was given a photocopied tourist map of Jaffna that was of dubious quality, and he was told that they had no more radios for him, so he'd be given one by the 72nd when he caught up with them. By the time Cole emerged from his meetings, his 2 tanks were ready to go, but that was the only good news. First, he'd gone looking for his 3rd T-72, only to be told that it had been sent on a loan with the infantry the day before. Second, Cole's commanding officer and the squadron commander that he'd been filling in for, who were both in Trincomalee, had, rather than fly up to Jaffna to relieve him as planned, elected to go on leave, and at that very moment were on a flight back to India. So, with 65th Armoured Regiment paralysed by a lack of senior officers in the same country as their tanks, Cole took command. He got his 2 crews together and decided to go in after the infantry. The Sri Lankans cheered on Cole's tanks as they left Pillari at 10:30 a.m, escorted by a jeep of MPs, who curiously decided to lead from the rear, and filmed by an Indian TV crew. Squadron Commander Cole had under his command 4 men in 2 tanks that weren't even fully loaded with ammunition. The commander of the 2nd tank was still flying in with the ammunition. They'd also dropped everything that wasn't mission critical, including their entire water supply. Upon reaching the main road, the MPs turned back and the tanks began moving south. Luckily for them, they'd been joined at the last second by a company of Sikhs, part of those diverted the day before who had finally arrived that morning. Also with them was Lieutenant Colonel Ranbir Singh, commander of the 10th Paracommando, and 2 of his men who had flown in from Colombo the moment they'd heard about the raid. The lot of them were now perched on any available space on the tank's roofs, and their orders were to assist 72nd Brigade for the establishment of a firm base for the capture of the LTT HQ in Jaffna University. The decision by the Gurkhas to begin clearing the route methodically ended up being a blessing, as the 2 tanks sped down the main road to no resistance. Cole recalled later, "We soon passed the burned-out shells of buildings and vehicles, some still burning. Bodies of unknown persons littered the by-lanes, and a strong smell of decay mixed with cordite permeated the morning air. Driving down a tarmac road was easy, and in about an hour we reached the infantry brigade we were to marry up with." The Gurkhas, officially the 72nd Infantry Brigade, were pinned down on the main road in Urulu, by fire coming from a temple some 600 metres away. The tanks pulled up just short of the infantry, and Cole saw his 3rd tank sat amongst them. He raised the crew on the intercom and learned that their gunner had been hit in the neck and evacuated, explaining why the brigade had stalled. Cole decided to dismount and stand on his tank to figure out what exactly was going on, only to be frantically shouted down from his tank by a JNCO, who alerted him to a Tamil gunman working from the temple. Cole jumped down and made his way into a ditch to meet with the officers of the 72nd. They'd come to the conclusion that every road and track was either mined, booby-trapped, or under the watch of the Tamils, and the 72nd Brigade was reaching its limit. Massively under-strength and under-equipped, its constituent units were now all isolated and pinned down in 4 separate locations within Jaffna. Cole was ordered to take his mounted Sikhs and accompany the Gurkhas and rescue Safi and his men in Condaville. The rest of the Gurkhas would continue fighting their way down the main road. Mishra asked Cole for ideas on how to deal with the Tamil roadblocks, but Cole politely told the brigade commander that it was probably best that he made that decision. He did, however, suggest letting him push his tanks around the Tamil positions and attack them from the rear with the infantry following. This Mishra agreed on. First, though, Cole had to rouse the crew of the tank whose gunner had been hit. The commander had refused to take over the gun despite being trained to the same standard as a gunner for this very possibility. Instead, he had panicked and left the tank to sit idle. Cole had his tank pulled up alongside and had his gunner fire on the temple housing the sniper. The roof of the temple was thoroughly demolished with a single round, and with some threatening language over the intercom, the commander was convinced to man the gun. Once the temple was dealt with and the promised radio set was found, discovered to be useless, and returned to the Gurkhas, the tanks and the accompanying infantry set off at 3 p.m. The column moved west along the ring road, in Cole's words, keeping 1 foot on the ground, bounding the tanks and infantry forward in teams. After a couple of kilometres, they came across the Jaffna railway, and Cole had an idea. One of the lessons taught to him at the academy had been regarding the use of modified vehicles on the railway lines of Burma during the Second World War, when the roads were impassable. So, instead of slowly blasting their way down all the roads of Jaffna, Cole, with Dalbier's support, ordered the column to turn onto the tracks, which were laid flat, and ran straight into the centre of Jaffna, directly past the university. The advance sped up greatly, though they were still harassed by smaller hunter-killer teams that hid in the woodlands and the clusters of buildings that lined the railway. The overall opposition, however, was much lighter, but the tight quarters meant that the fighting became much more intense, and the distance that it took place at got deathly short. On one occasion, Cole had to double-tap a villa housing a machine gun team, despite what appeared to be a white flag flying from the window. The combination of an armor-piercing round to make a hole in the wall, followed soon after by a high-explosive round at short range, completely demolished the building and everyone inside it. A similar situation took place as they closed in on the Condeville train station that had been converted into a fortress by the Tamils. Cole, against orders not to use his tank's cannon within the city itself, turned his main gun on the station's water tower, which was being used to direct Tamil mortar fire all over the city. The viciousness of the fighting only increased the further they went. In one instance, a Gurkha caught sight of a Tamil who had just fired a burst towards the tanks from around a corner, only a couple dozen meters away at most. The Gurkha threw down his gun, unsheathed his cookery knife, and ran down the Tamil who was still armed with his rifle and nearly decapitated the man. In Cole's words, the decapitated body of the militant went through its death throes as the Gurkha wiped his cookery with the slain man's lungi. He picked up his rifle and went back to marching with the column as if nothing had happened. Shortly after the lone gunman, the infantry began finding traps set up hastily along the railway line. It appeared as if the Tamils were beginning to move to defend against the tank's breakthrough. The column began passing through some cultivated fields, where a mob of civilians had gathered to block the way. The Indians halted and tried to figure out what was going on, but the crowd suddenly parted, and a machine gun position just behind the crowd opened up, raking the entire front line of the advance and instantly killing 8 Gurkhas. In the ensuing gunfight that lasted all of a minute at most, not just the machine gun team, but a number of men, women and children lay dead in the field. The ambush in the field was a wake-up call to the men that things were not going to get any easier. Subsequently, they became a lot less cautious in their targeting, and as they got closer to the Sikhs they were coming to rescue, they fired on anything they had a reasonable chance of identifying. On one occasion, at a range of 700 meters, Cole used his tank's-mounted Dushka machine gun against a platoon-sized group of men crossing the railway. When they caught up to where they'd been, they counted at least 16 dead. By 4:30 p.m., the column had arrived in Condeville and turned off the railway. The sight of Indian tanks prowling this far through Jaffna shocked the residents. Most fled, but many stood in awe as the tanks machine gunned Tamil gunmen, and the infantry desperately tried to maintain a perimeter. The tank crews pleaded with the civilians to return to their homes, but most refused, until the infantry began firing over their heads. One unfortunate who didn't move fast enough was knocked down by one of the tanks and crushed to death. As they got further from the railway, the advantage provided by the T-72s was nullified by the amount of obstacles. That either restricted movement or line of sight, and soon the tanks had inadvertently turned onto a short road that led to a temple that doubled as a major LTTE training ground. The column was immediately pinned by small arms fire that was quickly reinforced with heavy machine guns and mortars. At 5:50, the men had rallied, and Dalbir began leading an assault, though it quickly stalled when Cole's driver in the lead T-72 refused to move, and wouldn't respond over the tank's intercom. Climbing back down into the tank, Cole got his driver, who hadn't heard the call over the radio, ready to move, and then he resumed his place behind the Dushka, raising himself out of the tank just in time to see the RPG team fire from only 60 meters away. Luckily, the round hit the tank's mudguard and skipped. Unluckily, it detonated against the side of the main gun. Cole was peppered with shrapnel, though he wasn't immediately aware of the damage, recalling later simply that, "I felt like I had received a straight right punch, so to say, on the chin," though he quickly became aware that something was wrong when he turned to Dalbir, who stood on the engine deck, and he saw how he was looking at him. Cole was missing a chunk of his left hand and the right side of his face. He was pulled from his hatch, sedated, and laid out on the engine deck. Over the following hour, the column fought its way out of the ambush and towards the Sikhs still trapped in their house on the railway line. At 7:30, they made contact, but there was little time to rest or see to the casualties. The dead and wounded were piled side by side on the tanks, and the force now turned around and began to fight its way back out, travelling back up the railway to meet with the rest of the Gurkhas, who had been slowly following up behind. The two units of the 72nd Brigade were reunited just after 11:30 p.m, on the railway just north of Condeville, under a heavy rain. The dead and wounded were offloaded, but the tanks had to immediately turn back around, and with the Sikhs, set off once again to relieve the paracommandos. It was 1 a.m. on the 13th before the relief column got close enough to the stranded paracommandos to make contact with them over the walkie-talkies. Fortunately, they hadn't been attacked again after nightfall, but pinpointing their location for the column still wasn't a simple job. After 2 hours of trying to guide the column over the radio, it was decided to try a more primitive approach. Plan A was to burn a thatch-roofed hut to create a signal fire, but the rain put a stop to that before it began. Plan B was to fire off the last Very pistol round, but that too couldn't be seen from ground level because of the thick foliage. Finally, Plan C was to start a fire with the last of the plastic explosives. 3 paracommandos led by Bhadauria crept through the streets to a hut a short distance away and got a fire going. There they sat and waited a few tense minutes, wondering who'd find them first, and then finally they got the call from Dalbir. The column was 500 meters away. At 3:45 a.m, the paracommandos were reunited with the CO. The 6 dead and their wounded were loaded aboard the T-72s, which, by now, were all out of action. One was down to 15 rounds of machine gun ammunition, one had a round trapped in the breech, and the last had had its firing mechanism fail. Despite this, Shionam wanted to give the militants hiding nearby a warning not to follow them out of the area. Dalbir agreed, and for 45 minutes, the crew of the 3rd tank worked on the firing mechanism, but in the end, only managed to get one shot off. Disappointed with this result, and with dawn approaching, it was decided to turn back immediately rather than attempt to carry on. The civilians were released from the houses, asked to account for all their belongings, and the Sikhs were woken up, a majority of them having fallen asleep almost immediately upon arrival, having been awake and marching for the better part of 50 hours. In the rush to get back to friendly lines, it was discovered upon reaching the railway that one of the tanks had been left behind. The infantry dismounted and offloaded the dead and wounded, and the 2 tanks went back to rescue the 3rd, pulling it out of a ditch with minimal light and under increasing sniper fire as the Tamils woke up for another day of fighting. With the tank freed, they caught up with the infantry and resumed the advance. By then, it was daylight, and as they ran the gauntlet, they took fire from all sides. At least one of the Sikhs was killed by a burst of rifle fire as he fired his machine gun from the roof of one of the tanks. A wounded paracommando propped himself up on the tank and took over on the gun. Then, one of the tanks brought down a telegraph pole with its cannon. The wires were dragged for a couple hundred meters before the tanks had to halt, and while under fire, the crew spent 20 minutes untangling it. At 7 a.m. on the 13th, the tanks finally emerged from the railway at the Gurkhas' holding position in Condeville. For the first time, 72 Brigade was finally together as a single unit. The 6-hour raid was over, and as the Tamils advanced up the railway line after them, the next battle began. The Sikh platoon on the university playing field had been killed sometime between 10:30 a.m. and midday on the 12th. Once the sun had risen, exactly as predicted, the Tamils had taken them out one by one. After Major Birendra Singh had been killed, the remaining men had finally moved off the field and into one of the surrounding buildings, though it was too little, too late. With few remaining men and ammunition quickly running out, the Tamils had surrounded them and killed all but 3. Those 3 continued fighting until they'd fired every last round they could get their hands on. Then, They charged out the building, bayonets fixed. Only one of those three survived, Sepoy Gaura's Singh, who would remain a prisoner of the LTTE until the 18th November 1988, when he would be exchanged for the LTTE commander Kittu. He recalled later waking up as a prisoner and being ordered to teach his captors how to use the Carl Gustav launcher. Since he wasn't trained to operate the weapon, he refused and was subsequently beaten. However, he got the last laugh. He tried his best to explain how he'd seen fellow soldiers operate the weapon. A militant copied his instructions, raised the launcher, and fired it. The backblast killed the man standing behind him. The bodies of the other 29 Sikhs were never recovered. The LTTE claimed, though the Indians deny, that they contacted Pillari to offer to transfer the bodies, but got no response. What is known, however, is that the bodies were lined up outside Nagaraja Vihar temple, doused with petrol and cremated before being buried in an unmarked mass grave. The cost of failure was equally high for the rest of 72nd Brigade. Just over 100 men were dead or wounded, including a disproportionate number of officers. The number of Tamil dead, both civilian and militant, is unknown, though the fights on Pirampadi Lane and along the railway line are commemorated as the first massacres of civilians by the IPKF. Also unknown at the time was that the paracommandos, upon entering Pirampadi Lane on the morning of the 12th, had been only 200 metres away from Pirabhakaran, who was quickly packing up his belongings and disappearing into the countryside, warning his commanders via radio that the Indians were closing in and that his time may be up, suggesting that for a few hours the battle was a lot more closely fought than is believed. The failure of the university raid, however, meant that the fighting would go on in Jaffna for another month, ending with the capture of the city in November and the shifting of the fighting to the jungles and villages of Sri Lanka. After a lengthy investigation into the raid, marred by misinformation and back-covering, all involved would be cleared of any wrongdoing. Lieutenant Colonel Dalbir Singh, Major Shionan Singh and Sepoy Gangaram, as well as the 4 helicopter pilots, Sapra, Vidairaj, Prakesh and Duraswamy, would all be awarded the Vir Chakra for their part in the operation. Major Rajiv Nair and Captain Ajit Venayor would be awarded the Sena Medal, and the 4 helicopter co-pilots would be awarded the Vayu Sena Medal. The Indian Army would remain in Sri Lanka until 1990, when it withdrew, having lost 1,165 men. After that, the civil war that had been so close to ending in June 1987 would go on until May 2009, costing an estimated 100,000 or more lives. Today, save for a memorial stone at Pillari, now Jaffna International Airport, very little attention is paid to the opening years of the Sri Lankan Civil War, especially regarding the Indian involvement. Almost every account of the initial attack on Jaffna contradicts each other, and most details are lost or untold, as the Indian government quietly prevents the release of most of the official histories and reports to the public. They are quite happy not to pick at old wounds. All this to say, I hope all of you who made it this far enjoyed the video, and apologies for any details I may have overlooked in my research. As always, there are many more documentaries about forgotten conflicts and events on the way, and I hope to see you all there. Goodbye for now.